Well, hello, welcome to the 360th meeting of the New York Comics and Picture Story Symposium. This is a weekly series of lectures, readings, talks by people who make comics, people who think about comics, people who write about comics, people who have something to say about making stories with pictures in some way. Founded by Ben Catcher. I'm just going to mute everyone as people come in. Founded by Ben Catcher about a decade ago. My name's Austin English. I'm curating this season of the symposium. And I'm really excited for tonight's guest, Anna Woulfe, whose work I discovered, I think, maybe about a little over a year ago, maybe a bit longer. When I saw Anna's mini comics, this is not the first one I saw, but this was one I saw a little bit later that I was really taken with. I just immediately saw someone working in such a unique and beautiful way with the form. I could maybe see, little hints of people like Mark Beyer or something like that, but that didn't really matter what the influences were or what it was similar to, because the bulk of what was beautiful about it was that it was coming from such independent place. It wasn't necessarily, it wasn't coming from an independent place in the way that it might be incoherent or completely throwing everything at the wall and seeing what connects. There was a real base of storytelling and something very direct and affecting about every page and every panel, but it had this truly beautiful singular quality to it. And one of the things that I like doing with the symposium is people whose work I'm very interested in, but I don't know that much about. I haven't heard much of their statements about their work. Those are people that I'm very excited about inviting and having them present whatever they want to present, just to hear their own words, to get some perspective about what it is they're doing. So before I introduce Anna, I'm just going to say one of the features that Ben Catcher really values about the symposium is a unity between the audience and the speaker. So as Anna gives her lecture, I really encourage you to write questions in the chat. Just note down any questions you have, and we'll get to them. We can have you read them out loud after the lecture's over, or I can read them for you. But don't hesitate if there's anything that you're interested in exploring or just asking about. So Anna Woulfe is a mini comics artist currently living in Philadelphia. Without further ado, here's Anna.
Thank you, Austin. That was really sweet. I'm not used to video chatting at all. I really just try to avoid it as much as possible. So I'm really going deep directly into my darkest fears right now. But I'm gonna share my screen, and let's see. Hopefully everyone can see that.
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, cool. Yay. Well, so today I'm going to talk about, I guess, something I've been sort of figuring out for a long time, but that I've only tried to start articulating recently, which is an idea of trans-surrealism. Transness and surrealism is a pretty complex subject because they've been pretty interwoven over time, but not always for the best reasons. And I guess a question that I have been thinking about when I am approaching art making is what is a trans surrealism, or what is surrealism that is just made by trans people and not necessarily, exploiting trans people, which is honestly what most surrealism has been. In this picture, for the title card, I chose a picture of Greer Langton posing with her dolls. It was really hard to pick a picture of her. They're all incredible, but I liked that this one was really intimidating. I think the most intimidating part of it to me is the fact that there's this little sign up towards the top that says busy, busy, busy day. And I can't imagine like living near that all the time, like trying to like relax or fall asleep and just being reminded of what a busy day you're living. Anyways, that's a total tangent, but I love Greer Langton. I'm going to talk about her in a little bit. First, I just wanted to give a little background. I've been making comics for 4 or 5 years. I was mostly doing music stuff like more actively before then. But I was like very closely following comics and reading a lot of comics and drawing a lot, but never necessarily sitting down and making comics. It took a lot of time for me to get to a place where I could draw, I don't know, comics that were sort of things that I felt good about. But yeah, I was reading comics actively for a long time, and I was really lucky to sort of have come of age as like a freak and a punk in Rhode Island around like 2010 or so, when there were just a lot of really amazing people. I mean, there's always really great comics artists in Providence, but at that point in time, it just felt like there was so much coming out, and there was a sort of flashpoint for my brain in 2010 when I was 17, when I encountered a couple different things that I'm just gonna like briefly go through. I scanned two comics that I loved at that time. This is just some panels from If and Oof, which I took out from the Providence Library shortly after it came out. It's just a sequence of this weird little stranger eating a part of a mushroom and then just totally melting. For some reason, this panel where If is just like, do you have any snacks on you? We're really hungry in the middle of a like long adventure comic. Just was really mind blowing to me at the time, and definitely a sort of language that I, try and use in my comics. Another thing that I just like really, really fell in love with around that time was this comic by Mickey Zucchelli that describes a cordyceps mushroom infecting an ant and making the ant climb up to the top of a tree or a plant, just anywhere high up. And once it gets up there, a mushroom sprouts out of its head and spores down to the earth below. And then the spores subsequently infect other ants, spreading more. Both of these comics were just so cool and chaotic and playful and just like sort of in awe of the natural world. And I read these and was like, wow, that is the sort of art that I want to make for the rest of my life. And I think that I've stayed pretty true to that. I feel like anyone who reads these comics would, look at mine and be like, oh, of course, that's what Anna read when she was a baby. The other thing I encountered at that time was a column by Casey Plett called Balls Out, a column on being transgendered. It started in October 2010. You can tell because no one says transgendered anymore, but at the time that was how you described yourself. And it was just really just a basic look at the first year of someone's transition. And I had just been endlessly trying to figure out why I felt so weird and strange all the time and like what was going on with me. And it was really, really hard at that point in time to encounter any sort of art or writing by a trans person where they were in control of the subject. And, I had seen like Maury and stuff when people revealed that they were trans on there, but this is the first time I ever got to come across any sort of anything written by a trans person, and it was incredible. It changed my life forever. Yeah, it was very special. And Casey is still an incredible writer who's published 3 books now, and I'm a really big fan. Still, I've basically grown up with her writing. One thing that I did not understand when I was encountering this column is something that Casey talks about in an interview that she did a couple years later, when she says, when I was writing my McSweeney's column about my first year of transition, the audience I ended up developing in my head in terms of how to deal with jargon / vocabulary / perspective was that of a young trans kid who wasn't out yet and didn't really have any connection to a queer / trans community. Myself at 19, basically. Enough so that there'd been enough explanation so a kid like that could follow along without feeling dumb, but not so much that the explanation would devolve into throat clearing and hand holding for jumpy cis people. The idea that she was writing for this like shadow audience of cis people is sort of the main thing that I'm going to talk about tonight, because even still, when she was trying to write something just to help someone like me who is trans and needed something, she was still thinking about a cis audience and, like, you know, potentially offending or grossing out or confusing people, when that's ultimately not helpful to, you know, someone like me who's just trying to figure out how to live. But this, especially in 2010, was very just indicative of the times. Up until around 2013 or so, the main form of art by trans people was memoirs, and that was the way that you would get published, and that was the way that you would, you know, have any sort of chance in the world most of the time. And Falls Out is sort of like this straddling point where she's sort of writing for trans people, also sort of writing for cis people. A couple years later, Casey would switch to actively writing just for trans people. But this is very indicative of, yeah, the main sort of cultural output by trans people for most of the 20th century. And in an interview with T. Fleischman in 2016, Tori Peters described the way that this sort of art making functioned. And she described it way better than I could, so I'm just going to read what she said. Historically, much of the literary cultural production about trans lives has been for the consumption of a cisgender audience. Trans culture isn't and wasn't necessarily always about medical transition, but from Christine Jorgensen onwards, the popular narratives about trans lives have focused on the sensational or physical aspects of transition. As a result, mainstream cultural production has tended towards the literary forms, especially memoir, that most easily package, explain, and display transition for a cis audience. These memoirs follow a basic narrative structure. Act 1, everyone says I was A gender, but I felt like I was B gender. Act 2, I came out as B gender, took hormone / had surgery, and experienced difficulties or violence. Act 3, I was accepted as B gender by cis people and or was killed by them. I don't see my own life reflected in this narrative, and I don't see the lives of writers I know reflected in this narrative, particularly not the ones who transitioned 10 or 20 years ago. It is essentially an incomplete narrative, but one that has vast appeal to audiences with no experience of trans lives. However, if you rethink and reprioritize your audience as trans, you can't tell the story. They know that, at best, it's incomplete. When I envision an audience of other trans people, I expect they already know everything about transition, so I have to dig much deeper to offer up insight and honesty about the trans experience that might move them. So this really spells out how, you know, to be a trans artist for the longest time, you were basically selling your existence and also just kind of trying to convince people that you were real. And this idea of like real or realness is a really important thing to keep in mind when talking about trans art, and something that when I, you know, was thinking about like talking about like what a trans surrealness could be, and like all the things that go into that complicated relationship, I kept thinking about the idea of realness in ballroom culture. And so I have this clip from Paris is Burning that I want to play, which is like 4 minutes long, and we can watch that and then I'll keep talking.
To be able to blend. That's what realness is. If you can pass the untrained eye or even the trained eye and not give away the fact that you're gay, that's when it's realness.
Banji, looking like the boy that probably robbed you a few minutes before you came to Paris's ball.
The idea of realness is to look as much as possible like your straight counterpart.
Shake the dice and steal the rice. Right here. Come on, baby. Yes, Daddy. I got my food stamps and card waiting. All right. Done. Coke, base, soap, Rolaids. You got it.
The realer you look means you look like a real woman. Or you look like a real man. A straight man.
Sweetheart, with the cigarette, you're giving me a Banji girl effect. This is Banji. You know, the girls that be on the corner talking about, yo, man, one that can hang out with the ruffin and the
It's not
tuffin.
a takeoff or a satire.
Can we have a score, please?
No, it's actually being able to be this.
Brenda Extravaganza, looking like a Banji girl. Banji. Banji girl realness. You know, one that can take our little baby brother to school. One that say, you know, like, hey, I saw a bunch of those things walking down the street.
It's really a case of going back into the closet.
10, 10, 10, 10. Are there any more? Okay, girls, have we come to a decision?
They give the society that they live in what they want to see, so they won't be questioned. Rather than have to go through prejudices about your life and your lifestyle, you can walk around comfortably, blending in with everybody else. You've erased all the mistakes, all the flaws, all the giveaways, to make your illusion perfect.
My mother knew I had trophies, but I was telling her I won them for basketball, and I had won trophies for running track. I was walking up 145th Street with my girlfriends. I had on white hot pants, a chiffon blouse, a ponytail, and my father was waiting for the light in his car, and he saw me. He recognized me, and he went straight to my house before I could get there and told my mother, "Your son is a woman." She didn't press it then, but like maybe a few months later when she noticed that I had breasts, everything started coming together. She really was devastated. How could you have breasts bigger than mine? You're growing nails. You're becoming a woman right before my very eyes. I can't hold my head up. I'm embarrassed. She still loved me, but the nagging and the, oh my God, about this woman's clothes. And when I had women's clothes stashed in my closet and she found them, she would destroy them. She burnt up a mink coat. I was so devastated. She smelled the perfume in it that I liked to wear, which was Jungle Gardenia at the time. And she said, "This ain't no girl's coat. This is your coat." Took it downstairs in the backyard of the building and burnt it. And I stood there and cried like a baby. As long as I have a mustache and all that, it's cute for me. She don't want me to be in no girl's clothes. She can't take it.
When they're undetectable, when they can walk out of that ballroom into the sunlight and onto the subway and get home and still have all their clothes and no blood running off their bodies, those are the femme realness queens. And usually it's a category for young queens.
I've watched that clip so many times, and every time they like show the trophies, I think like right there, I'm just like, ah, they have the best size trophies. I feel like if I was ever given a trophy, I would want it to be really annoying and hard to handle. Like, I want it to really take up a lot of space. I love their trophy style so much. But I show this clip to just sort of give it as an example of how on all levels, realness is a concept that trans people are constantly thinking about. And, you know, it's a struggle that we see played out in the New York Times or in our government and, you know, basically every part of the world right now. And, you know, being real or making realistic art or just writing about yourself and trying to validate yourself it just becomes a matter of survival. The idea of realness for a trans person is either getting home or, you know, getting published or something like that. But I didn't understand any of this when I was first trying to, you know, understand myself, and I was experiencing all this cool art being made by people that I looked up to, and then I was also, you know, understanding transness and like trying to find examples of trans artists that I could look up to, like who was a cool trans artist. And
To be able to
I
blend.
know. Okay, there we go. Really, at the time, you could only really learn about, you know, obviously I was looking for examples of transness of all kinds, but really I just wanted to find trans women to understand if I could exist. And you could really only find examples of trans women in the context of famous men. And so on the left is Rachel Humphreys, who Lou Reed was, I mean, basically he considered them to be married for a couple of years. But once, I mean, he was ended up being a really bad boyfriend and they broke up, and then she basically disappeared. We know what happened to her now, but for the longest time, no one knew what happened to her. Candy Darling and Andy Warhol are on the right. Candy died tragically young at 29, and Andy Warhol lived on into the 80s, was able to, you know, take all sorts of other people's ideas. I have a complicated relationship with him. I'm very opinionated about him. But the most like prominent example of a famous man who basically like collected trans women is Salvador Dali. And I didn't put that much effort into finding pictures of Salvador Dali and trans women. But I pulled up 4, basically just like, I don't know, just like casually searching. I could have pulled up so many more. He was constantly hanging out with trans women and drag queens. He was just obsessed with them. I consider him a chaser, which is, you know, just a cis man who is obsessed with trans women. And, you know, I've got the receipts. And there's a lot more evidence out there too. But it was like, you know, for a lot of people at the time, that was like their claim to fame, like International Crisis. If you ever learn about her, like Dali is mentioned almost immediately, because that was how she achieved any sort of notoriety, is because she could hang out with him, and he really just like tracked down a lot of trans women. But, you know, he interacted with transness in a way that is really just bad. I mean, I have a lot of problems with the original Surrealists in general. And, you know, they hated women, and so it makes sense that they would be like weirdly fascinated and also disgusted by trans women. But you know, Salvador Dali was obsessed with trans women, especially before they had bottom surgery, and would often try and paint them. And I feel like his wording was usually trying to paint hermaphrodites, that sort of thing. He basically considered a trans woman to be inherently surreal. And so, you know, all of these trans women hanging out with Salvador Dali then makes it just also broadcasts out to the public that like being a trans woman is inherently surreal. And we can see this also happening with Barbette, who was a early, or like a 1920s trapeze artist who would perform dressed as a woman, and then at the end of Barbette's performance, Barbette used he, him pronouns. Using pronouns for people like 100 years ago is really confusing, so I'm just going to use what they used during the time. So he would, you know, perform as a woman and then like reveal that he was a man at the end. And it was like this, that was basically the whole act. He was like a good trapeze artist, and then he would like shift his body language slightly and everyone would be amazed or something. But Jean Cocteau, who was like not necessarily a surrealist, but like adjacent, was like obsessed with Barbette. And he convinced Man Ray to take these beautiful pictures of Barbette, and I'm really glad they exist. Like, I think that this is such a cool artifact from that time. But Jean Cocteau really shows his hand in this essay that he wrote in 1926 when he's talking about Barbette. And he says, "It is not until he pulls on his blonde wig held by a simple elastic around his ears that he will take up, while putting a bunch of hairpins in his mouth, the slightest posture of a woman doing her hair. The transformation is complete. Jekyll is Hyde. I am scared. I turn away. It is my turn to be intimidated." Which is like, I don't know, that's just such, he just sounds like a baby. But also it's like clear that like, you know, his fascination with Barbette and the idea, like incorporating Barbette into his sort of like surrealist milieu, it becomes this fixation on like how grotesque the very idea that this person who, you know, was not assigned woman at birth could, or however you want to say it, could like present as a woman. And so you really see there just like why Jean Cocteau was so obsessed and disgusted at the same time. And then the final person I'm going to talk about from like the original surrealist world is Claude Cahun, who I do have a big soft spot for. I really like her art. But that being said, the reason, like what is surreal about her art is that basically she could just be really masculine if she wanted. And yeah, that is what is considered surreal in a lot of her art, is just this general like gender bending and nothing actually that interesting. But because avant-garde movements always sort of bleed out into popular culture, we saw this happening around when these trans memoirs that Tori Peters was talking about earlier started to get published. So on Christine Jorgensen's, we see candid, intimate, the true story of her astonishing sexual change. And then on the poster for Christine Jorgensen's movie, we see, did the surgeon's knife make me a woman or a freak? And then on Man into Woman, edited by Niels Hoyer, it says, the almost unbelievable book deals with the outstanding biological phenomenon of a man who changed his sex. And then finally, on Conundrum by Jan Morris, I actually really like this one. I think An Extraordinary Personal Narrative of Transsexualism is pretty cool, and I might use that again sometime. But you know, at the same time, it's just like extraordinary. When actually that book is like really boring. And I mean, I honestly didn't even finish it. It's just, it's exactly what Tori Peters described, where it's like, oh, I felt really weird for most of my life. And then I transitioned, and now I'm just a travel writer who's a woman. And it's really not extraordinary, but because the world was trained to view transness as this inherently surreal thing, that's the way it's presented. So I guess when I'm like thinking of all these things together, and thinking about how these are books, you know, intended for a cis audience that are presented as surreal, I guess I, you know, would think like, well, what is a trans surrealism? What is surrealism by trans people for trans people that isn't exploiting or anything like that? One person who I mentioned earlier was Greer Langton. She's mostly known for her dolls. I really love her drawings. They're so weird and cool and beautiful. And her relationship to her body was so complicated, and like you can really see it in like every piece of work that she makes. And like, yeah, bodies are just presented in all sorts of different ways. And someone that a lot of people watching this are probably familiar with is Edie Fake. Edie's Gaylord Phoenix series, I think, has a really cool way of exploring bodies and transness in a very like abstract and surreal way. But I think the person I want to talk about the most today is Rachel Pollack, who just passed, and I don't know, is kind of wild timing, because I've been planning on talking about her for a while, but yeah, she died like a week or two ago. She was most famous for her writing on tarot cards, and like the tarot decks that she made, and a lot of science fiction books that she made. But what I'm going to talk about is this run that she had on the DC comic Doom Patrol that she was doing in like the early 90s, where she was the head writer. And there are just like tons of like sort of inside trans jokes like hidden throughout the series. But a couple issues in, she introduces Kate Godwin, who is considered the first trans superhero. And I think, you know, you can see on the panels on the left, she's talking about how she tried to join the Justice League. And she says, I suspect they liked my powers, but couldn't handle me. And then it zooms in on put a transsexual lesbian on the Supreme Court, which is a really cool thing to have in like a 90s, you know, normie superhero comic. But also, you know, if you think about the way that all those memoirs and books that we saw before presented, you know, the reveal of someone being trans or whatever, this is like such a low-key thing that you might not even understand what's happening. You might just think she has a cool button. But that is like, you know, you can tell that a trans person actually wrote this because it's just no big deal. Actually, it's weirder that the Justice League just wouldn't let her in. So then later on in the issue, there's this like supervillain man named the Codpiece who's terrorizing the city, and Kate like quickly throws on this mask, and then we see the big reveal of like her powers in action, and she says coagulate and then just gives this guy a blood clot, and then she dissolves it. And like, you know, that's a pretty unique superpower, and probably most people reading it were just like, oh, that's like weird and graphic, but cool. But like any trans woman reading that would know that blood clots are the thing that like everyone talks about. And if we go back to Balls Out, a column on being transgendered, Casey, like one of the first columns, quotes her doctor saying, the number one thing you've got to worry about is blood clotting, he said softly. You're at a much higher risk for one now than you're on hormone therapy. That means if you ever get any swelling in your leg or your ankle, you go to the emergency room. Just go. Drop what you're doing and go. Because if it's a blood clot and it gets to your lungs, you can die in less than half an hour. And that's just like what you're told when you're starting estrogen. It's this thing that you're supposed to be absolutely terrified of. And obviously it is very terrifying, but You know, like 10 years later, maybe a little bit less, Casey wrote a book where one of her characters is like, have you ever met another trans woman who had a blood clot? I've never met anyone who that happened to. And like, I relate to that. It is presented as so much of a bigger deal than it seems to be, at least in my experience. And it was even more intense when Rachel was writing that comic, because at the time, the main estrogen that was being used was Premarin, which was synthesized from horse placenta, Premarin. And since you're putting, it's like, you know, you're putting horse hormones into your body, so it's like, it's just not as like acceptable to put in. And so the chances of blood clots were like even greater at the time. Now what's used is called estradiol, which is bioidentical and a lot less complicated. So basically any trans woman reading the comic at the time was thinking about coagulation. And that, I just think that's so incredible. And when I think of a surrealist way of approaching art that is, you know, by trans people and for trans people, I imagine something that is playing with our greatest fears and playing with like the plasticity of our bodies. And I think that that sort of thing can be really liberating, because we have to deal with the law in our day-to-day lives. And, you know, to be able to make art for each other that plays with these things that are just part of our everyday life, I think is really important and cool. And that is sort of the way that I've tried to approach comics, is just trying to come up with this language that I'm describing of a surrealism that is like using these parts of trans existence to articulate trans existence, but also play and expand on it. And I'm gonna finish off with a comic, like a sort of, I guess, a video version of one of my comics. I don't know, in case anyone hasn't read any of them, or maybe just as a nice little end cap on, you know, me talking about this. This is one that I did just like in a week, towards the end of 2021. And I made this video version over the weekend with my friend Jory. Jory has a fever right now. If she's watching, I hope she's feeling better. I hope it lifts tonight. Thank you for helping me with this. So yeah, without further ado, I'm gonna play this.
And then Papa was like, I thought that was soda.
Oh, I finally started progesterone the other day. My nipples are going wild. Yeah, go on, touch it.
Smells so great. I can't wait to start.
We're so lucky, Ember. We have the most beautiful bodies. Because they're totally our own. We're the rare flowerings of a boring species. It's the best.
Winky, I love you. And you're totally right. I just wish everything beyond that didn't feel so mysterious and unobtainable.
Okay, I guess that's it. I hope that made sense.
Oh, that was amazing. Thank you so much. It was especially that was beautiful to see that work at the end like that. I have a bunch of questions that I wrote down that I'd like to start off, or I'm going to limit myself to one question. I encourage people now to start putting their questions in the chat, but I'll start off with, I think one of the interesting things listening to what you're talking about is, I know with teaching, like surrealism is always such a strange term for students. I think students, they often resort to talking about surrealism in terms of like something that's weird or something that's strange. It's like kind of this shorthand. And I always feel like what was really beautiful about your talk is like exploring what to me surrealism is really about, a potential for like a more political content, or a different way of thinking about the world that might destruct the kind of dominant conservative reality that we live in. And it's always so disappointing to me when I read about the founders of surrealism, how, inherently homophobic they were. And it just seems kind of like such a sellout of what they just couldn't, their conservatism they couldn't free themselves from it. It seems like what they were writing about would be directly opposed to their social attitudes. And I'm wondering, my question to you is, do you think that the content of their manifestos or their writing has enough in it to transcend who they were as people? Or do you see those attitudes in a bulk of the actual work or a bulk of the actual writing? Like, do you feel that with your project, you need to like come up with a new definition for it that's not in the texts themselves? Or do you think those texts, if we separate them from the personal attitudes of the artists and founders, do you think the original conception of what surrealism is has some potential for what you're interested in, if that makes any sense?
I think so. I mean, I find them all like so annoying. And like, I don't know, I think that like they were onto something, but yeah, like what you're describing, like it doesn't really add up, like the way that they lived and the things that they were talking about. And I'm also not like the biggest expert. Like I wouldn't say that I've like, read all their manifestos and stuff. I kept trying to think of like art by like Dali or something that I actually liked, but I kept thinking of like a cover of like a Far Side anthology that had like melting like wiener dogs instead of clocks. I don't know. I kept thinking of like parodies of their art. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like one thing that when I was learning more about their stuff that I liked is they were really obsessed with this quote from L'Autremont. I don't speak French, but it's something like that. Where it was like the chance encounter of like a sewing machine and something else on an ironing board or something. I liked how they sort of like focused on mundane objects and saw just like inherent surreality in like the world. Like I think that there was something to a lot of like their interest in just like things from the everyday and how, you know, there is a surreality and like just like two things being paired that you would never expect or something like that. But I don't know, I think that as the years went on, they just became less and less interesting to me. So I guess I'm trying to come from a different perspective for something. I'm still working to articulate this. This is like maybe the first attempt, and I might like disagree with this completely in 5 years. But this is
any worthwhile idea, I think that would be true about. But can I just ask you just a brief follow-up before I get to the first question from the audience?
sure, yeah.
What about the term surrealism to you then is useful to you? Like I can definitely guess at reasons why it's useful, but maybe I got a sense of that in your talk. But could you maybe say like why you chose trans surrealism, to use surrealism specifically?
Yeah, I think it's useful because it's like a household term at this point, and so it like I guess is like maybe getting towards something that I'm trying to articulate, that maybe it comes across quicker. I do think it is like interesting to think about the way that transness and surrealism has interacted and like, you know, sort of like trying to, I don't know, use that word in a more positive way, or like sort of, I guess, I mean, reclaim it, I feel like is a typical word used in this sort of situation. But yeah, to just sort of like acknowledge the history of that term and maybe point it in a new direction.
There is a question from Benjamin. Now, Benjamin, do you want me to read this out loud, or would you like to read this question? I'll count to 10. Okay, I'll read it. So Benjamin says, thanks for the wonderful talk, Anna, and I really enjoyed the babes in the brackish video put together at the end. One of the aspects of your work I really enjoy is the way that text turns into an expressive graphic element on the page in terms of both location and style. It isn't always in the word balloon, for example. Do you have any thoughts on the graphic qualities of words in your comics?
Oh, I don't know if I can necessarily give like a satisfying answer to that. I feel like the way that I like start, or the way that I like draw, is that I often start with a blank square or a rectangle or a circle, and then I just try and like fill in as much of that as I can. I just like redraw it over and over again until it has like the right amount of like chaos and I don't know, coherent chaos, I guess, going on in it. And so like sometimes it makes sense for there to be word balloons. Other times I just want the words to be like really big and emphasized, or just like to convey something else. And I guess just like not having it in a word balloon can help expand beyond just like simple conversation. But yeah, often it's just like intuition and just what feels really good in that panel. It's not. I definitely don't have like a formula for when that happens or anything like that.
Laura Mathis says, "Thank you, Anna. That was so beautiful." I'm going to go
Thank
on
you, Laura.
a question from Maria. Maria, do you want to read this question, or would you like me to read it? I'll just go ahead and read it. Maria says, can you talk about how the internet and digital spaces intersect with your work in trans surrealism, thinking about your amazing website?
I feel like often the internet has felt really limiting to what I am to my work. I don't know. I'm not on social media or anything because I had a really hard time translating myself into that sphere, and it also, I just found it so stressful. So I focus on a website, which is sort of, I mean, I love websites, and like making a website is like kind of the most fun thing on earth for me to do. But I don't necessarily know if I can connect it to the idea of trans surrealism, because if anything, that is just like an extension of myself, and like just like sort of my funny little like internet apartment, and a place where people can learn about me, whereas like the comics that I'm making are what I consider to be like trans surrealism. But my website is more just a way of like communicating things, and also just having like a fun place. But I'm glad you like my website. That's cool to hear.
I don't think I've seen any social media presence from you, and I wasn't aware that you had a website that you were actively using. Can you talk a little bit about maybe if I'm correct in that you don't? I mean, I tried, like, for instance, for this talk, I tried tagging you and couldn't find you. But can you talk a little bit about maybe why you don't use social media, if it doesn't necessarily need to connect with these wider ideas you're talking about?
Yeah, I just I don't believe that I feel like right now there's this sort of idea that like if you're an artist, or if you want to be connected to the world, you have to be on social media. And I don't believe that there's any sort of one way to be an artist. And I honestly, just being on social media made me feel horrible all the time. And I just didn't want that in my life. And around the same time, I got rid of my social media, and I went back to a flip phone. And that was like a couple of years ago. I have no regrets. My life feels great. I feel very free all the time. And I think that one of my favorite things about not having social media is that I don't feel any sort of pressure to like post. I really like that, like, basically I'm making art and I can show it to friends if I want to. But if I am basically like I finish something and people see it for the first time in a zine form, there's no like, like sort of like sharing the comic as it goes, or like things like that. I often found that that was like informing what I was making, whether I liked it or not. There was just a lot of things that I found like influencing me and distracting me when I was on social media. And so now I'm just like, just drawing at like that desk right there. And I'm not really like thinking about like sharing my work or anything as I go along. I just have a finished thing eventually.
Is the website Deeper Clarity?
Yeah.
What does deeper clarity mean? What is the thought behind that?
It's just when I was 21 or 22, I like I guess, yeah, it was when around that age, I had like horrible insomnia, and I was more of a musician at that point in time, and so I made an album that was supposed to mirror a good night's sleep. I like read a bunch of books about sleep, and like sort of mapped out this whole album of music that like yeah, followed the arc of a good night's sleep. And when I finished it, I actually started sleeping way better. Like I sleep pretty well now. It sort of like, I don't know, cured me of whatever I was dealing with. But the last song on that album had the words deeper clarity in it. And then so when it was time for me to like register a URL, I just thought deeperclarity.net was like funny and weird URL. And I just stuck with it because it's annoying to have to register more. So it has nothing to do with like what I'm doing now, but that's where that came from. Also, I just like it because it's like if you want like more clarity about what I'm doing, if you want deeper clarity about what I'm doing, you can just go to deeperclarity.net. So it does like make sense in a functional way too.
Yeah, it's an interesting phrase. There's a question from Lind. Lind, do you want to read this?
Yeah, I would love to, if you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, hi Lindley.
Hi. You were just talking about sleep, so actually it's a good segue, because I was just thinking like, it's really tempting to think about realism as kind of like this default of just like real life. And I think that, you know, something I've always loved in your comics, and you've been doing this for so long, is like the top 10 at the end of every issue. And it's like, it's sort of the placeholder. I mean, you usually have like a description about yourself, but it's like in publications, it's like, here's the work, and then like, here's something about the author. And I think that those can be so dry and boring. And I think I really have always enjoyed sort of learning you in this relational way of like, these are all of the things that like you're into and that your friends are doing. And it's a really nice way to like sort of contextualize the work that you're doing. But I also am just like, every time you talk about your life, you're like, yeah, I got like a new bed. And then there's a picture of it. And it's just the most like fucked up, dangerous, like, you know, jigsaw plywood headboard. And it's like so beautiful. And I guess so to get to a question about it, I'm just like, what are some ways that you think about surrealism or this idea outside of like comics? You know, because it's like, I feel like you're a person that just had like so many practices, and you've talked about music a little bit, but like, you know, expanding out a little bit. That's my question, if it makes sense as a question.
I think it makes sense as a question. I feel like for me, like surrealism, I mean, I'm talking about it in this like comics, you know, symposium, because that feels really true to what I try to explore in a more visual setting. So I don't know, I mean, how much I incorporate it into like other modes, but I mean, the bed that you're describing is like, it has this like really, it's a jagged headboard, but it's supposed to look like a crown or something, or like flames rising like from behind my head. And so like, I mean, definitely like I like to be surrounded by fun, cool stuff. And a lot of the times it's like, you know, maybe like a slightly surreal version of things or something like that. But yeah, I don't know. I don't fully know how trans surrealism works for me outside of comics. For me, that really feels like a purely visual expression. But I'm gonna think about that. Next talk I do, I'll go into that one.
You were talking about this idea of, you know, a form of realness is getting published, you know, early in the talk you were talking about that.
Yeah.
And is the idea of self-publishing or making, you know, distributing work in the way that you do in these units, these self-published units, is that connected to ideas around your, I mean, is it tied up to the larger ideas that you were talking about, making work in this way and publishing it yourself outside of the system of making work that's palatable for a mass market publication?
Definitely. I mean, yeah, when I guess like realness is getting published, it's sort of like this idea that like for you know, if you're a trans person who's trying to get published and you go to a publisher and it's just all cis people working there, probably you're just gonna get like a memoir published, you know, like at least like for most of the time. I think that there's a lot more um, understanding and people like thinking outside of just traditional narratives now, but like that was the norm for a while, and it started to change in the mid 2010s, like Casey Platt, who I mentioned, and some other people started like actively trying to publish books and start publishing, like start presses that were run by trans people and like publishing things for trans people. So that's definitely changed. That is like, you know, that's more of a historical concept, and like I think it's a bit easier nowadays to get something published that isn't explicitly like a memoir, but definitely like it makes sense to me that the first thing that Casey had published was just her like describing her transition, because that is like what was marketable and easy for people to understand as like, oh yeah, people will read this because it's like, you know, extraordinary or whatever. So for me, it's like, I mean, I also just kind of don't know what to do with my stuff, and I'm just used to putting it out. I'm used to putting things out myself anyways. So it I don't know. It's something I'm used to, but yeah, I wouldn't even know who to like send the things I'm making to. I don't know. Maybe it's also like I'm being lazy, or well, no, self-publishing is never lazy, but like maybe I could figure out something. But yeah, it's definitely like I just don't know like who would necessarily be interested in publishing things about like trans women eating flowers all day and stuff. Yeah.
Juliet asks, what are you working on next? Do you have any dream projects in your back pocket?
Yes. Thank you for asking, Jory. I have like a couple comics set so you held up the Out in the Girl Farms #1. I'm working on #2 for that, which is like maybe that's like sort of a long-term one. In the meantime, I've been working on a comic that I had a surgery in February, and so I've just been thinking so much about surgery, and I wanted to make a comic that played around with surgery in some ways. And so I'm going to make a comic about this trans woman who's in the like sort of girl farms world, who goes through like extensive surgeries and hormone treatments and things like that in order to become impregnated by pollen and give birth to a flower. So that's like the next thing that I'm gonna draw, I guess, after I think I've been like preparing for this talk for a second, and then I'm gonna start working on that. So I think maybe those are my dream projects. I haven't been just dealing with a lot of medical stuff this year, so I haven't had too much time to draw, and I'm just really, really excited to start doing that again.
I have one more question that I'll ask. I encourage anyone to ask a final question if they have one after I say this one. But the piece you showed at the end with music and just going panel by panel and performance of voice, I thought that having read your work before, I thought that was just such a sometimes when people adapt their comics into a medium like that, it loses some of the beauty of things, but I thought that really heightened a lot of what I've been seeing you getting at. So do you have more plans to work that way and incorporate audio and performance in some kind of ways?
That's like, I guess, going back to Jory's question, I guess that is kind of my dream project, is to like kind of get it together to do more live performances of comics in that way. I have only done a live one once, and it was so much fun. And yeah, I mean, I mentioned like I was a musician. I toured a lot, and like played music for a while, and that's like a big part of me that I haven't really like focused on in a while. And I feel like when I do these like comic performances things, especially like sort of when they're more of like a noise set, like comics reading, like it just makes so much sense to me and sort of like brings together all my favorite things to do. So it feels really good. I want to do more of it, and I would ideally like, you know, take it on the road a little bit, but I just gotta get it all together and figure out a plan. Making that video was really nice, and I think that maybe I might, in the meantime, just make more like video versions of them, because yeah, I do think that in some ways it's like the ultimate way to experience the comics that I'm making.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that you would do live performances, but it just like having it just, I think it was just sound, whether it's recorded and presented in the way that you did it or sound presented live. I thought that was such a brilliant addition to what you're doing. I mean, it just kind of, it didn't like, the sound didn't bring things down to earth. It kind of heightened the beauty of it.
Cool, thank you.
Well, that was such a great talk, and I really thank you for your time, Anna, and I thank everyone for asking questions. We will be back, and I'm gonna put in the link to your. I'll put this on the YouTube version of this as well. But I'm just gonna put a link in the chat so people can check out your website. We will be back next week at the same time, same way to register, with Pris Janae, a cartoonist and publisher, also from Philadelphia. And so, yeah, we'll be back next week with that. Thank you so much, Anna.
Thank you, Austin. Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.